Warmly welcome to today's discussion in vår Frue kirke, Our Lady's Church. The theme for this year's Olavsfest is justice, and Diakonhjemmet and its cooperation partners invites every afternoon or evening to a discussion about justice here in this church. Today, we will discuss justice in the context of transboundary labor market in Europe, together with senior advisor Kristin Velure Strøm from Caritas, Norway, and PhD scholar Mateus Schweyher from RETTFERDIGHET Specialized University. And both of them will get a chance to present themselves a bit more thoroughly very soon. My name is Annette Rose-Leis Peters, and I'm based at RETTFERDIGHET Specialized University, and I'm there responsible for the PhD program, one of our two, that has the name and the focus on diaconia, values, and professional practice. And it is my privilege and pleasure to facilitate this discussion today. Diakonhjemmet is a faith-based foundation within the framework of the Church of Norway, with the aim to promote diaconia in church and society through its welfare and care services and its activities. And it's, for example, also one and the biggest owner of the private faith-based university, RETTFERDIGHET Specialized University. We are sitting in Our Lady's Church today, an open and diaconal church where voluntary hosts make sure every day that all people can come and have a coffee. And we think this is a wonderful and very suitable framework for the discussion that we are having. And before I will give the word to Kristin and Mateus, I just have to mention, as coming from RETTFERDIGHET, that this is very special for us to be here in this room on Olavsfesten, because one of our PhD scholars, Gyrid Gunnes, who successfully completed her dissertation, her PhD project, last December, only half a year ago, has focused on Our Lady's Church here in Trondheim and on the work that is done here. And her thesis has the title, Towards a Diaconia of Displacement, an Empirical Theological Inquiry, and it is accessible, open access digitally. So this is very special to be here. Our daily routines in Europe, and not at least here in Norway, have become more and more reliant on working migrants. That means that people choose to cross borders in Europe to find a work. The COVID-19 pandemic, with its reintroduction of national borders and its increased attention to how we live, how we move, and how we behave, has made us aware both of this dependence, but also of the living conditions of many working migrants, often difficult living conditions. So on this background and in this context, we now want to discuss these important questions. And I want to start with asking Kristin and Mateus to present themselves. So please, Kristin, do you want to start to say something about you?
Yeah, and thank you. My name is Kristin Velure Strøm, and I work as a senior advisor, as you mentioned, for Caritas Norway. And I work on the topics of migration and integration. And I've been working with Caritas for a couple of years now, but I've been working on different migration-related topics for more than 10 years, and also working directly with victims of trafficking and victims of other forms of exploitation in my previous jobs. So what I share here today in terms of experiences and in terms of views, it's mainly based on my experience from Caritas, but also from previous work experiences.
Yes, hello, my name is Mateus Schweyher. I'm a PhD student at VEET Specialized University at the program Diaconia, Values and Professional Practice that Annette mentioned already. And I have done my research project on Polish labor migrants in Norway, and especially those who come into situations where they are not able to access the public welfare services and come into situations of need where they often also go to organizations like Caritas to get other kinds of support. And my own research, I have actually done most of it at different organizations, including Caritas, Kirkens Bymisjon, Frelsesarmeen, and Røde Kors in Oslo, where I both interviewed the migrants as well as the leaders and social workers who work in those organizations. But also an important part for me was to attend meetings between migrants and advisors, and where their situation is discussed and where it becomes clear what kind of issues are the barriers, but also what kind of opportunities there maybe are for these migrants. And I want to say that I'm myself an EU citizen in Norway. I was born and raised in Germany, but I have also Polish family background, so I speak also Polish, the Polish language. That's why I could interview the Polish migrants and also attend advice meetings between Polish-speaking advisors and the Polish migrants in Oslo. So that is my background, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. Justice is the theme of this Olavsfest and also our conversation. Justice for working migrants in Europe. And is it possible to achieve justice? Actually, when we planned this discussion, we were thinking of starting with the injustice. But just before we go into injustice, I want to ask you, Mateus and Kristin, could you please tell us if you have met the term justice in your work, maybe in a way that stayed particularly in your mind, a way of justice, an understanding of justice that kept you thinking?
Do you want to start or should I?
I can start if you want to.
Yeah.
And it is a bit, as you say, Annette, that when I was preparing for this talk and reflecting on the topic of justice in terms of EU labor migration, a lot of examples of injustice comes to mind. Perhaps not so surprisingly. But then thinking about how we in Caritas are working, our goal is to achieve more justice for our visitors. And for those of you not so familiar with Caritas, we are the aid organization of the Catholic Church. And we actually, well, up until sort of about 15 years ago, Caritas Norway was only working internationally. And we started working in Norway with integration on the demand of labor migrants, you might say. Labor after the enlargement of the EU in 2004, many labor migrants, especially from Eastern Europe, came to Norway and found challenges when it came to their working situation, housing situation, just coping with daily life in Norway. And they went to the Catholic Church or to their congregation and were in need of help, and they asked for Caritas because they knew Caritas from their home country, And now they needed help from us. At that time, we didn't have any activities in Norway, but that was sort of the gradual start of what we now have established, and that's information and resource centers in a range of different cities in Norway, including here in Trondheim. So it was very much a bottom-up initiative, you might say, so that we started our activities based on the needs of those who visited us. And when I think about justice in our work, I think about sort of the very practical steps of justice, where we could help a labor migrant through a Norwegian course that makes it easier to navigate Norwegian society. Or we can help someone who doesn't know much about the system in Norway to better understand his or her rights, so that it's easier to stand up against an unserious employer that tries to take advantage or to exploit. So it's these, you might say, quite small steps that we try to do to empower labor migrants, of course also everyone coming to us, to make living and working in Norway a bit easier.
Thank you. And Mateus, you have also met some understandings of justice in your research, haven't you?
Yes, exactly. When I did the interviews also with the leaders of the different services for migrants in Oslo, one particular quote or one thing that I was told kind of resonated with me, and I want to read that out actually. It's in Norwegian because the person was talking to me in Norwegian, and I thought that it's nicer to not translate it because then we have the actual words. So this person told me: "Vi jo blitt litt påvirket av sosialisme i Norge. Gjør din plikt og krev din rett. De har jo alle arbeiderfolk alltid sagt. Du skal alltid gjøre noe for å få, ikke sant? Og det jo veldig rådende i det norske samfunnet. Du kan få hvis du har gjort noe. Og der skiller det seg fra en kristen tankegang. At du får en ny sjanse. Du får det bare av nåde. Du får det uten å ha gitt først. Og det vi tror på da, jo at det forandrer mennesker. Når du får Guds kjærlighet, så gjør du noe." And I think this quote, what I think why it fits also into this discussion is that it points to two very different logics and two very different understandings of justice, and both can be probably, in some situations we would say, oh yeah, this sounds like justice, this sounds fair, right? First you do something and then you get something for it. So I think when we have this discussion about justice, it's interesting to keep in mind that there are very different understandings and they can have very important consequences in society. So yeah, that's why I wanted to bring this up in the beginning.
Thank you, Mateus, and it might be that we get back to this later in the conversation. But now we were talking about that you would share some concrete examples of injustice that make us understand the situation of working migrants in Europe. Maybe this time you start, Mateus, and then...
Yes.
Kristin.
I wanted to share the story of one of the migrants that I followed over some time, that I accompanied to different organizations, but also to the public authorities. So I got to know his story a little bit better, and I also interviewed him and had informal conversations. So this was Martin. He was in his 50s, he was divorced and had lived in Norway since 5 years at the time. He had worked in a car wash and was employed through a work agency. That meant that he didn't have like a permanent contract with guaranteed amount of hours, but more like he was called when he was needed, and when there was no work or when he was not needed, then he had time off, or he didn't have any work. So he was waiting for the next call, so to speak. And in his case, he was also provided accommodation through the employer, so everything in one package, so to speak. And initially he said things were quite okay, he was satisfied, he was getting regular work, and the living conditions were okay. But after some time things were changing, things were better. He was moved a couple of times by his employer to different accommodation, which was significantly worse conditions. So for example, at some point he was actually sharing a 3-bedroom apartment with 14 other men. He was sleeping in the hallway because there was not enough room in the different bedrooms. And also with his employer at work, there were problems. Payments were delayed or not happening at all. At one point, the employer came to him and told him that he had to work 9 hours, but should only write 7.5 hours into the Timeliste, and the other thing was an unwritten part of the contract. And if he didn't agree, then he would have no work anymore. There were also problems like, for example, when he fell sick, or once he fell sick and once he injured himself and couldn't go to work for a couple of weeks, and each time the employer refused to pay sykepenger, so he was without income during that time. And what later also came out was that the employer hadn't always reported the full income or the full salary of the migrant to the authorities. So he had paid taxes only for part of the work that Martin had done, but other parts he had just kept the taxes, which meant that the reported income on the paper looked smaller than it in reality was. And in 2018, there was quite some media attention around the working conditions in car washes in Norway. So at the time, a couple of car washers decided to take over migrants and employ them directly with better contracts, but Martin was not among the fortunate ones who got such a contract. But nevertheless, at the time he decided, okay, I have to leave this employer, this is too much, this is not getting any better, and he left. But the problem was he immediately lost also his accommodation, and he didn't have very much savings, so he couldn't afford to pay both the rent and the deposit for a new apartment or even a room. So he was sort of homeless. He was staying with friends, but then this was also not always possible. So often he also had just to find places to sleep. And he went to organizations like Caritas to get support, and they tried to help him. For example, they helped him to write a CV and search for work, or he was then able to send the CV to a couple of different car washes, but also other announcements for work, but he was not successful. And they also helped him to apply for dagpenger and økonomisk sosialhjelp, but both his applications were rejected. The first one for dagpenger because his reported income wasn't enough to qualify him for that, because there's a limit which you have to earn during the last year or 3 years. And for økonomisk sosialhjelp, you have to show that you have a connection to Norway. So for example, that you are renting an apartment, or that you have family in Norway which you are supporting, and also that you are registered as a resident. And he was registered with a D number, which quite many migrants are, because you can only get the fødsels number, which is the proper registration, when you can show that you have 6 months of guaranteed work in advance. And because of his contracts with the work agencies, he never had such a contract, so had not gotten a proper fødsels number. So ultimately, since after 3 months, he decided that he was running out of his own savings and he had nowhere to live, so he decided, in fact, to return to his employer, because that was better than having just to live on the street and having nothing at all.
Thank you, Mateus. Kristin, you are surely also thinking of some concrete examples from your work.
Yeah, I am. And I guess one of the, sort of having worked with trafficking and forced labor and labor exploitation for quite a few years, I think one of the things that I find the most shocking still today is to see how common that story actually is, and how that happens to so many, and it's widespread, and it's often, in many cases, quite out in the open. And you mentioned like a car wash, and a car wash is often a typical example where working conditions are often very bad, where there are long working days, where there is no overpay, where accommodation is organized by the employer. And in that sense, the employer also have a lot of control over often his, but it can of course also be her workers. So it can be, well, the person working in the car wash connected to your local shopping mall. It can also be the woman washing your local supermarket or cleaning your local supermarket. It can be the guy renovating your neighbor's house or even renovating your own house. It's something about creating an understanding that also within a Norwegian context, this is quite, unfortunately, quite common. And I think for many of us in sort of the Norwegian context, thinking about, well, everything is so well regulated in Norway. And surely if these terrible working conditions took place in the local car wash, someone would notice. The police would stop it, or the labor inspectors, they would find out. But that isn't necessarily the case. And car washes, unfortunately, still today, quite appalling labor conditions are detected, even though car washes have been a focus for the government, for the authorities for quite some time. And sort of looking at injustice in terms of what is happening, what sort of speaking with labor migrants who are being exploited at work and who try to seek help. What makes a big impression on me is that it's when they realize that there is so little help to actually get, that their rights when it comes to legal assistance, for instance, if they're exploited, are very limited. Often, like you mentioned in the case of Martin, their rights of any sort of social support are also quite limited. And it's not so unusual, like what you mentioned with Martin, that someone could end up going back to the employer that exploited them, or they end up finding a new job, but still with an employer that continues to exploit them. So you could say it almost ends up being a vicious circle of exploitation.
Yeah, you were pointing to also the legal aspects of this, and we like to think of Europe as a continent where we are fighting for human rights and applying the human rights as far as possible. So how can we end up in situations where European citizens end up in such injustice, and it is in a way part of the European project, it seems to be. So what would you say from your research about this? Is it?
Yeah, I think I have been thinking about this, and I think this brings us also a bit back to the quote that I said in the beginning, that I read out, and that what we see, and that is also what many other researchers are saying, is that this emphasis that you have to do something first in order to get something. In Norway, people often say, du må opparbeide dine rettigheter i Norge. So you have to earn your rights before you can get something. That this kind of logic has become very strong in the freedom of movement in the European area. And that opens, I think, also the doors for those. At least it is one of the aspects that creates these vulnerabilities, because what has been observed is that many, not just Norway, but many of the EU countries have, for example, made their definition of what is work and when is it enough in order to be included in the welfare state and get support from the welfare state. They have made it more and more restrictive. So, for example, work needs to be continuous for a year, which for many, in order to keep your rights after you become unemployed, for example. And for many migrants, this is just impossible because they work on such contracts that are 3 weeks here, 5 months there, 2 weeks there, and all the time interruptions in between, especially in the construction industry where it's a lot of assignment-based contracts, but also in this work agencies, for example. And then, of course, there's the criteria for income, that you have to have a certain income in order to get rights. And of course, people who have interruptions in employment will more easily have also lower incomes. So it comes together. And then if then on top of that, your employer doesn't report the employment correctly, then it's quite easy to fall out of the system. And that is what some researchers have called this sort of a market citizenship, because you get rights according to economic class or economic status. So it's said that those in safe and well-paid employment, for example me, who has a relatively stable job and a good salary and an employer who is honest and reports everything correctly to the authorities, I will most likely have no problems with getting social rights or social support if I would need it in Norway. Whereas those who work in those precarious, unstable and exploitative conditions are much more at risk, even though they are the ones who would actually need it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mateus. We were talking a bit about the migrants who are coming to you at Caritas Norway, and that they are mostly from Europe, aren't they? Or could you say something about this and also this European focus in your work? Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. About, or the majority, about 75% of the people who come to Caritas are EU labor migrants. The largest group, or at least for the last couple of years, have been Polish labor migrants. And then the second largest groups, and perhaps a bit surprising to many, are actually Spanish citizens. That could look a bit different in Trondheim than what it does in Oslo. And they're not, or most of them are not born in Spain. Many are born in North Africa or in Latin America. And they've been immigrants in Spain for a number of years, gained citizenship. But then during the financial crisis in Spain, a lot of them struggled to find work in Spain, so then they came to Norway. So in some sense, they have like a double vulnerability, or sort of a bit more of a complex migration history, you might say. In some ways, you could almost say that the majority of those we meet at Caritas are subject of some kind of injustice. Of course, in sort of different ways and in different scales, but labor exploitation, for instance, in different forms, it's very common. So I guess like one thing that is a bit important to keep in mind for us as well, like you having done your field work with a number of organizations working with vulnerable migrants, and also me sort of working with vulnerable migrants, that we are also a bit colored in our view on the challenges that we see from labor migration. For instance, with Polish labor migrants, they are actually the largest immigrant group in Norway. And we don't hear much about them in many ways, because they work, well, they manage quite well, and they get on with their life without sort of the need of assistance from Caritas or other organizations, or with much need from the state. So in that sense also, labor migration for a lot of people, well, it is, and from Caritas' perspective, we believe that labor migration for many well, it's for the common good. And it does create conditions, you might say, for justice, or at least like for more equal opportunities, you might say. But of course, keeping that in mind, we also meet a lot of injustice in our work that we need to find better ways to address. Yeah.
Yes, and that brings me to the next question. If you, as a researcher, Mateus, or you as working closely with migrants, if you could decide on the frameworks, what would you do to bring more justice to working migrants from Europe in Norway? Mateus, maybe you want to start?
Yes, I think my first answer as a researcher would be, well, we as researchers, we like to point out problems and show what doesn't work, but we are not necessarily the ones who suggest what to do with it, how to fix the problem, right? But nevertheless, I think it is, what I would say is that it is worth to remember that this is maybe not such a completely new and unmet situation as it might appear on first sight, because of course we had the issues of poverty, of exploitation and so on in our own countries as well, and we have managed to establish welfare systems that were, especially here in the Nordics, very successful with creating a very high standard of living for everyone and ensuring that people don't fall into destitution and homelessness and these kind of situations. So when we think about the welfare states as they are, I want to come back to actually the quote in the beginning, because there we see that, or when we look at the welfare states, we see that they don't only have the element of conditionality, of contribution, that first you have to contribute and then you get something. They also have this element of needs-based support. So if someone needs something, that will qualify them, even if this person hasn't before worked or contributed in paying taxes and so on. So I think, and there were very strong reasons also why we developed is, for example, of course, there's the aspect of human dignity, and that we want to prevent this kind of suffering in our societies. But there's also this idea of democratic participation, that we have recognized that in order for a democratic society to actually function, also with the civic and the political rights, we need sort of a minimum economic stability for the citizens. For example, if we have someone who is homeless, who is hungry, who doesn't have even access to education, for example, then this person will not be able to, for example, take someone to court simply because of the physical condition in what he is in. So we need to ensure that people are able to make use of their rights, and that is also why the people who, when the welfare states in Europe were developed, they were called enabling rights. So they were meant to enable people to participate in the democratic society. And I think Martin's case illustrates quite starkly what happens when we remove this unconditional layer of welfare protection, because it doesn't affect himself. Oh, yes, it affected him because he had to return to his employer because he simply didn't have an alternative to live from during the time that he needed to find a new job. But it also affected society in the way that he couldn't take the employer to court. He couldn't sue him for the money that he was owing him, and he couldn't also ensure that the employer sort of gets punished, or that there is justice is delivered. Because if he would have done it, then of course he would have lost his livelihood, which was at the time his only source of livelihood. So I think what we see is that when we remove this unconditional basic layer that we have in all our Western European welfare states, like økonomisk sosialhjelp in Norway, and all the countries have some sort of economic assistance that is not conditional upon previous working. That has wider effects on the whole society, and the labor unions in Norway also say that if labor exploitation happens and is allowed or is not addressed and punished properly, then that affects also other companies who want to provide serious working conditions, because they will not be able to compete with those companies who engage in such social dumping and exploitation. So, yeah.
Good. Thank you, Matthew. Kristin, you are nodding. Do you want to fill in on what should be done?
Yeah, I'll pick up on a few of your points as well. What you say is very interesting, and when you're talking about like enabling policies or to sort of make it easier also, I guess, for labor migrants to realize the rights that they actually have. Because we could say that their rights aren't good enough, and in some cases that's absolutely true, but another challenge is also that they cannot properly realize the rights that they actually have, because they're not aware of them, because information does not necessarily exist in their language, and they have not managed to learn Norwegian, because Norwegian classes are actually quite expensive and not so accessible for many who prioritize working and sending money home rather than to spend money on learning Norwegian, for instance. And for quite some time, or since the EU enlargement, the Norwegian government have had you might say, like laissez-faire policy. They've sort of let labor migrants come to Norway, they can stay, they can apply for jobs. If they find a job, they can stay. If they work for a certain amount of time, well, then they have rights within the Norwegian welfare system. But they have not sort of introduced any specific measures or any specific policies towards labor migrants, so they've had, in many ways, to manage for themselves. And it seems like, luckily, hopefully, that is somewhat changing now. And I think actually also the corona pandemic illustrated very well how much we need labor migrants, from farmers who did not have anyone to help with the harvest, from the shipping industry on the West Coast, to the construction industry, healthcare sector, well, you name it. There are so many examples, that there is a larger realization that also from within the Norwegian economy, that labor migrants are important, but also that they will need some more assistance than what they have now. And in Caritas, for instance, we have been trying to talk about the need for language courses for years now. And for the most part, we have almost been sort of looked at as naive. Well, that will be so expensive. How can you talk about Norwegian courses for labor migrants? They work, they should be able to pay that for themselves. Whereas now it's gradually changing, and there are more initiatives, luckily also from the government, to support the language courses for migrants, which is, a very positive development.
Time is running, but I want to have a very last question before we start to close up. But this seems like a highly political topic, and we were discussing both legal frameworks and policies. But it is also a topic for churches and faith-based organizations. You were mentioning the list of the organizations working with this issue in Oslo, and there were most of them faith-based. You were telling us, Kristin, that Caritas was actually asked for stepping in and working in this field from working migrants. So finally and very shortly, maybe starting with you, Kristin, what do you think is the role for churches and faith-based organizations in this complicated issue?
I think we have a very important role. And we can fill a different form of, we can have a very different approach than the authorities. And especially when it comes to working with labor migrants, what we often see that the fact that they know us from their home country creates a level of trust that they do not necessarily have towards the Norwegian government. And also in our work, Caritas, we have both staff with a legal background, with social backgrounds, but we also have a number of volunteers working with counseling and information, and most of them have immigrant or minority background themselves, and they speak a number of different languages. So we can meet the visitors in a very different way than often what a public office can. And then we can also be there to look for new ways of doing things and to look for new ways of searching for justice, you might say. And in that sense also, we work a lot with advocacy or policy advocacy work towards the authorities to explain to them what reality looks like on the ground, that hopefully, that's at least what we work towards, can also change the framework we work within long term.
Thank you, Kristin. Do you want to fill in, Mateus?
Yes, I think what you are talking about, or what I hear from what you are saying, and also what comes in this quote in the second part, and I will maybe just read it out, the last sentence of it. Du får det uten å ha gitt noen først, og vi tror på det jo at det for andre mennesker. Når du får Guds kjærlighet, så gjør du noen. I think for me, this is something about trust, and I think often when we think about migration, immigration, there are initially some fears that, oh, maybe there will come too many and this will be a problem for our welfare system, and therefore we treat them differently than we treat our own or the people in our country whom we somehow trust more to work and to do their thing. So I think this openness, or this kind of more like, okay, we trust that you will contribute to our society, is an important approach in order to be more successful to integrate people in society.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kristin and Mateus. Our discussion illustrates that it is complicated to understand what is justice in this situation of working migration, and that there are no simple answers. And I think this picture that we have as a picture throughout the series also illustrates this ambiguity in a very good way, because it could be both seen as the chains that keep us captured in difficult, unjust conditions and keep the working migrants captured. But when we are talking a lot about the welfare system, a chain could also be something very different. It could be a symbol for a last way, a last hold when you are getting a difficult situation, something to hold on when you do not have any other help in life. And also it symbolizes that you are connected in a way to society, that there is a contact and that you are not ending up alone. So it is a very ambivalent picture on the background of our discussion. And we hope that we could illustrate some of the injustices, but also bring some signs of hope from the work that is done, and is not at least done by faith-based organizations and by many individuals and volunteers who work in these organizations. With this, we want to thank you for your interest, and we want to warmly welcome you to tomorrow's discussion at the same time, 5 o'clock, klokken 17. And then you will meet a new team of discussions, and they will talk about the subject "Å brenne for barnas beste," to be passionate about the well-being of children. Warmly welcome, and thank you for coming.